welcome you in my turn. Thank you for coming today to our conference. I hope you're enjoying it. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Henning Holle from the University of Halle today. Dr. Holle did his PhD, his doctorate in Max Planck in Germany, working on how gesture and language interact in the brain. He then moved to University of Sussex as part of the synesthesia group, right? Working on a project on mirror task synesthesia. And he's currently a lecturer at the Department of Psychology at the University of Halle. Among others, his interests involve how the neural and cognitive mechanisms underlying human language, and with a particular focus on gestures and gesture-supported communication. So today I'm very excited to welcome him and introduce him because I'm part of the gesture research myself, and he will be sharing with us methodological challenges he had when, while you're working with gesture, with a particular focus on EEG, and also a very tricky thing that gesture researchers phase, which is called the inter-observer, the determination of the inter-observer agreement within gesture research. So thank you very much for coming as well.
Yes, thank you for inviting me here. This is less of a content talk, so it's really, I'd like to talk about some of the problems, challenges, whatever you want to call it, I encountered during my research, and some of the things you could try to get a grip with these things. So, yeah, there's basically two parts that I want to talk about. First, as Evie mentioned, I'd like to talk about the little toolbox that we've recently developed to assist basically anyone doing observational research that has to demonstrate that observers are reliable in their judgments. So it should be helpful for anyone that needs to do that. And the second part, I will talk about some of the methodological challenges if you want to use methods such as ERPs and MRI for gesture research. You've already seen that in Keaton's talk, so this is a typical situation when you're doing gesture production. Yeah, you need to elicit the thing that you want to study. I just wanted to remind you, so this person has just watched a film on the laptop. This is German, so you're not hearing any speech. Well, one thing I'd like to draw your attention to is, well, we're interested in gesture, or they were interested in gesture, but not all behavior is gesture. Yes, you ought to see that there's shifting or some self-touches. Yeah, so the first thing, the first task, if you want to analyze these videos, is to identify the units of interest. Yeah, where does the gesture start in the video? Where does it end? Yeah, only when you have done that, so I've tried to illustrate it here with the blue lines. Only once you have done that, you can then decide what particular type of gesture is it that we observed during this segment. Yeah, so it's a two-stage process: segmentation and categorization. When you do this kind of research, what you're basically getting is categorical data. Yeah, and the brains of your raters, they are your scientific measurement instrument. Yeah, you're not using EEGs, you're not using fMRI, but these judgments that the raters make, they are your scientific measurement instrument. Of course, as every measurement instrument, they need to be calibrated. Yeah, you need to demonstrate to yourself and also to the world out there that your raters are reliable in their measurements. Yeah, and basically the logic is you need to demonstrate that one video being analyzed by two raters produces essentially the same results. Yeah, how can you do that? Sometimes life is easy. Yeah, sometimes you do research where you have a very constrained context. I don't know, maybe you have a set of lights and people just have to point which light is illuminated. In this case, it's already pre-segmented. You don't have to find the unit of interest first. Yeah, so segmentation is not an issue in this case. Or sometimes a researcher might transcribe everything a person is saying in these videos, which I've never done it, but I think it takes a lot of time. If you've done that, you could, for instance, identify each syntactic phrase in the transcript and then simply say, was there a gesture of type X or not? So in this case, segmentation would also kind of have been done already, but what happens if there are two gestures in a phrase? Anyway. Or you could do something where you use time units as the unit of interest. Yeah, so you could, for instance, have your video and divide it into equally long chunks, say of 100 milliseconds, and then you determine for each time unit, was there a gesture of type A or no gesture, and then the next time unit was a gesture of type A, and so on and so forth. Yeah, that of course, I think when you rate behavior, that's not what you do. You don't ask yourself on a millisecond by millisecond basis whether there was a gesture or not, but you look for whole events. Yeah, so when you do take that kind of approach, you tend to overestimate the real number of decisions that raters have taken. Well, if you want to retain this information about these events that I've shown you before, you want to retain the event structure? Well, at least in the field of gesture, the person that seems to be most interested in this is Janet Barvelas, I don't know how to pronounce her name. And what she suggested is, well, they are two distinct things, segmentation and categorization. Why don't we split them up and do things in turn? Yeah? So at first, we could have two raters independently identify the units of interest in the video, gestures, without specifying what type of gesture it is yet. And then you could report how much they agree with respect to the segmentation. So that's the first number you could report. Then in her, a paradigm, or whatever you want to call it, the raters dissolve. They talk about all the cases where they disagree and they resolve that. Sometimes this might require a third opinion. And then once all the segmentations have been resolved, the raters would actually do the categorization. And then again, report the amount of agreement in categorization. Okay. It has I think it has some intuitive appeal to it. But I've never done it, but I'm just curious what happens during disagreement. How can you resolve disagreements? Like, you're not allowed to talk about the gesture type. Yeah, because if you would, that would artificially increase your agreement later on. Yeah, so you could only talk very vaguely. Oh, I sort of think I haven't seen a gesture there, but I'm not telling you why. Anyway, so that's probably one issue there. Another thing is it really reasonable? Is that really what you're doing in your head when you're rating these kind of videos? Do you just detect very general, oh, that's a gesture? Or is it more that you already have a specific gesture type in mind when you identify a unit? I don't know. It just stands to question. So this is where our own work comes in now. So when I had a very brief postdoc in Germany with Hedda Lausberg at the beginning of 2008, and she was then actively developing a new coding scheme for gesture, very complex coding scheme, and she had lots of annotation data. Yeah, so people annotating up to several hours of video material, and we wanted to know how much they agree with respect to their annotations. So that was the context here, which is called the NeuroJazz coding scheme. And this is different, for instance, from McNeil, who Kita introduced as his own coding scheme. There, people also listen to the speech. Yeah, so the annotation is done based on what you hear and what you see. Hedda's coding scheme is purely visual. Yeah, so sound is turned off. You code these movements based on what you see alone. And I remember I talked to Hedda back then, well, can't we somehow separate this and first get an estimate for segmentation and then later on for categorization? But at least in her scheme, it is definitely not possible because these two things sort of interact during the annotation process. Yeah, so you might see at first just general, okay, there was hand movement, and then you ask yourself, during this segment, is it of the same type throughout, or are there different types? Is the movement sometimes repetitive and sometimes unitary? If that is the case, you would divide it into subunits, and then the next check would be, what about the location of the movement to the body? Is it always on the body or sometimes on the body and in space? If it is the case, you would again divide it up into further units. Yeah, so the point is, at least in this scheme, segmentation and categorization sort of take turns, they interact. Yeah, so you could not imagine a case where you do just the segmentation first and then a complete distinct categorization later. Would not make sense. Okay, so this is a bit of a complex set. I hope I don't rush through it. So this is the kind of data we started out with. So there are 3 programs that you can use to annotate video data, where you have a little video viewer and you can skim through it frame by frame. And then these raters place their tags here. So for instance, rater 1 has seen here a movement of the type IOV. Doesn't matter what these categories stand for. And you tag also the extent of the movement. And then the second rater does the same thing, has no access to the ratings done by the other rater, and you get annotation data in that respect. So the challenge, or what our toolbox does, is basically taking this kind of data to end up with an agreement table, such as here. So here you can see how much 2 raters agree, and so for instance, agreements here on the main diagonal in green. When 2 raters disagree, they come into the disagreement field shown in red. So for instance here, the first bit you could say segmentation agrees. Yeah, so both raters have identified a segment that's of similar length and that overlaps substantially, but they don't agree on the label. Yeah, so this, for instance, would go into this field here. Yeah? On the other hand, you sometimes have false positives or false negatives if you take segmentation into account. Yeah? Sometimes you might have a case where, for instance, one rater sees a movement that cannot be linked to an annotation from the other rater, so that's why you need an additional category, we call this nil, to account for these commission or omission errors. Yeah? And that's the general framework. And we make this decision. So the first decision is, how should we link these segments between 2 raters? Yeah? Without being blind to label. We're only looking at the segmentation. And we do this based on the overlap. Yeah, so we identify all the texts that have at least a bit of overlap with annotations from the other rater, and then only annotations that overlap for more than, say for instance, 60% are considered they are linked. I hope that makes sense to you. Yeah. So, for instance, here, this tag overlaps with this one, but the percentages overlap is much less than 60%. Yeah, it's only, I don't know, 10% of the length of the local text. So that would not be linked. Yeah, it would be tallied as a commission or omission error. That's how it works generally. Yeah, and the user can specify how conservative he or she wants to be with respect to the overlap. Yeah, if you're very concerned about timing, you can set a very high value here. Yeah, so then units will only become linked if they very closely agree with respect to their onset and offset times. Yeah? That's basically what the algorithm does. And so it gives you these raw agreement tables, it gives you raw agreement scores, and also chance-corrected kappa indices. And we really tried to design it in a way that it would be useful for the greatest cohort of researchers. So, for instance, we are aware that other gesture researchers use a system that's more consistent with the Bavella's approach. So for these kind of people, we provide agreement indices that only use basically this part of the table, yeah, because all omission errors are taken care of in the previous step. Yeah, so there are agreement indices that only focus on agreement and disagreement as well. And we have some tools in there to sometimes have the case. There are these two people, they have annotated 50 videos. You just want to have a quickly get an idea where are the problems, which videos cause the greatest disagreements between raters, or which categories are especially contentious. There are also tools in there to help you with that. And you can download it for free. Is this really an issue, or is this just us filling our time? Well, it seems to be. Yeah, there's this reason. This is not from gesture research, but in the field of observational research on animal behavior, there was recently a review, and 96% of the studies in that field do not report anything with respect to inter-rater reliability. So, in the field of gesture, there is definitely a greater awareness of this. But one thing we encountered that it's difficult to get an idea of what people actually do if you just look at the papers, because it tends to be reported very, very briefly, and it's often, or most of the time, it's not clear what the percentages that are reported actually reflect. Yeah, so what we did then really was to write emails to everybody that presented at the last International Gesture Conference to get an idea of what do you do with respect to inter-rater reliability. I got replies from 13 people. There's probably a response bias here. One person said, I don't do inter-rater agreement at all. Most of the people that have replied have a procedure in place that takes into account both segmentation and categorization, and a smaller number of people have a procedure in place, but they only consider categorization, disagreements in their procedure. What is the case in the field of gesture, though, is that about half of all the studies only report raw agreement indices and not chance-corrected indices such as kappa. Yeah? So you'd often read, oh, raters agreed by 90% with respect to their category decisions. This is a bit of an issue. Yeah? Here is the data. So after we've developed our algorithm, we also validated using real data that Hedda Lausberg provided us with. Yeah? So there were 6 categories in this movement scheme, and here in blue you can see the frequency there. So some categories were much more frequent than others. So for instance, there were 100 annotations for the category S with the shift here. And on the right-hand side, you can see the agreement indices that are provided by the algorithm. And in blue, that's the raw observed agreement, what you find in many papers. Yeah? You can see that generally raw observed agreement is very high. Yeah, 85 to 95%. Sounds impressive. Yeah? If you look at, for instance, just the category shift here, raw observed agreement is 97%. Wow, that sounds good. But it's much less impressive if you consider that chance agreement in this case is 92%. And the chance of two races agreeing with respect to shift movement is 92%, and that is always the case whenever one of these categories is very infrequent, yeah? Because the marginal distributions aren't always very different. The point is, you need chance-corrected agreement indices in addition to raw agreement indices. And I think, again, my abilities in mind read are limited, but I think what many people are doing is they simply go through the videos and they just say agreement, agreement, disagreement, disagreement, and then just count the percentages. But if you really want to calculate the overall kappa, you need something like this. But you only can generate something like this if you have clear linking rules of how you want to link the annotations from one rater with another rater. Yeah, so I really hope that our toolbox will be helpful in this respect. Okay, enough about that. On to the second part of the topic. I mean, you've already seen videos from Kita and the video that I've shown you at the beginning. Gestures or co-speech gestures are spontaneous behavior that tend to be very variable, rich, and complex. This really conflicts if you want to use methods such as ERPs or fMRI, because there what you really want is stimuli that are as simple as possible, and you want the most control over your stimulus that you can possibly have. Yeah, so the ERP studies, as a rule of thumb, many people will tell you, oh, you need at least 40 stimuli per condition. Yeah, so that already, if you just would compare two conditions, you would need 80 stimuli. That should be as similar as possible and should only differ on the one thing that you want to manipulate. How can you do that when you have these very rich and complex gestures? Yeah, so written words is a good example. Yeah, if you're interested in words, your life is kind of easy. Yeah, so words are codified. There are published databases that you can use. You can access 10,000 words, and then you say, I only want 8-letter words, and you can get a really good control over your stimulus. You cannot really do that with gesture, yeah? At least not with the kind of spontaneous co-speech gestures. They are not codified, there aren't any databases where you can simply pull them out of. You have to go through a very laborious process of finding a stimuli in the first instance, and you need a lot of them because the method requires you to have that, yeah? That's part of the story. The other thing is, for instance, for ERPs, you need a very clear onset. Yeah, you need a very clearly defined onset point to which you want to time lock your analysis. Now, with gestures, they have several phases most of the time. Yeah? So you have a preparation phase, you have a stroke phase, where the main method of movement is. Where should you time lock your analysis to? Should you use the preparation phase or the stroke phase? These things are much more variable in gesture, and that's one of the problems for methods. So what can you do then? Well, the most popular paradigm is probably the mismatch paradigm, where you're simply comparing congruous with incongruous combination of gesture and speech. Yeah? So saying, writing, well, gesturing, writing, and comparing that with an incongruent combination. I don't know. Writing. It's very difficult to produce these. That's probably the most popular approach, and it does have its strength. Yeah? Because if you combine it with counterbalancing, you can ensure that across the whole set of participants, every stimulus item effects are perfectly controlled for it. So you get a grip on these complexities of the material. And that's probably why it is very popular in research. Yeah? And then you could take the amount of interference that is caused by these incongruent combinations as an index to how much impact gesture has on comprehension. Yeah, if these spontaneous gestures were completely meaningless, you should not expect an interference effect. The more incongruent gestures interfere with your language, the greater of an impact gestures have. Yeah, so you can do this way. It's using reaction time or brain-based measures such as the N400 that Guillaume has introduced. That all works very well, but one of the issues I think is that speakers don't really produce these clear-cut mismatches naturally. But I think it comes back to a point that was made earlier. What we really want to understand is the natural interplay of gesture and speech. How can we get a grip of that if half of the time what we're presenting is something that doesn't occur in the real world? Another thing is what does it reflect really? What do we see when we observe, for instance, the reaction time was greater for incongruent versus congruent combination of gesture and speech? Does this mean that our language comprehension system has to work really hard, that there is an increased integration effort going on? Or is this the failure to integrate information from gesture and speech? Or is this just a general detection that there's something strange going on? And finally, I think many people study gesture because they might have some. They want to show that gesture helps. Yeah, they want to show that gesture is important. It plays a major role in communication. But with the mismatch paradigm, you can only ever demonstrate interference, but you can never demonstrate that gesturing helps relative to a neutral baseline. So that's one of the reasons why we came up with a paradigm beyond mismatch. So here we presented sentences that were semantically ambiguous, or boxer, can have two meanings. Could be a sport, or could be a dog. And we figured that, well, if gestures have meaning, if they're communicative, then they should disambiguate the ambiguous words, which would subsequently modulate the ease or difficulty with which a target word can be integrated into the context. And that works very well, so we saw beautiful modulations of the N400 amplitude. But what about auditory disambiguation cues? So it could be the case that when you say a sentence and make a gesture related to boxing, that how you say it is different from the speech you're using when you're talking about the dog meaning of boxer, if that makes sense. So the speech alone might already contain disambiguating cues. And one of the things that we did in this study and also in follow-up studies was to use cross-splicing. Yeah, so cross-splicing basically means combining auditory recordings from different sources. You can tag points of onset in the audio recording and therefore reduce the variability. Yeah, so in this case, the audio recording up to this point was always physically identical and only different from the point onwards. So the idea is, if you have already this very rich and variable visual information, at least try to get as much control over the auditory channel as you can. And you can then also combine this with a neutral baseline. And here in this experiment we use simple scratching movements, so we call them grooming, with the idea that, well, this gives you no cue about what kind of word meaning is being targeted, so it's semantically neutral with respect to disambiguation. And this allowed us to see that the gesture effect is really a facilitation. Yeah, so the N400 for the gesture condition was significantly reduced compared to the incongruent and the unrelated grooming condition. So that's one of the strengths of the disambiguation paradigm. We also took this idea of using grooming as a baseline condition to an fMRI experiment. Similar logic, but now the sentences were shorter and completely ambiguous, and the only disambiguating information could come from the hand movements. And we did, for instance, observe stronger activation for gesture relative to the baseline in the posterior temporal cortex. But here you see one of the problems is that grooming is only an imperfect visual control for gestures. You tend to groom only with one hand, whereas gestures often involve both hands, and the whole amplitude of the movement tends to be greater for gestures than for grooming movements. And as you probably know, this posterior part of the brain is very involved in visual processing, and there are some very motion-sensitive areas near to the activation that we report here. So is this really a gesture effect, or is this just a visual motion effect? And there isn't if you want to go beyond mismatch paradigm, there isn't a simple answer to this. Other studies have used different kinds of control movements. For instance, this study had people who did not know anything about sign language, and they produced American Sign Language signs as the visual control condition. In this study, they used what they call free gestures, so they took the stimuli, so I don't know, hi was one of the gestures, and then they said, okay, this will be the control gesture. But the thing is, it's very difficult to come up with meaningless movements. People will always go on a hunt to search for meaning in these hand movements. So it's kind of difficult to create a control condition that is A, meaningless, and B, a good visual control. I think I'm almost out of time. This is just the last slide from a very recent study where we use an interaction rather than a simple subtraction design. Here we were interested in beat gestures, so simple emphasizing gestures. Of course, there isn't any semantic information there in the hand movement, so the mismatch paradigm is really out. You cannot manipulate semantic congruency if there isn't semantic meaning in the hand gestures. So in this experiment, we manipulated first the visual appearance. So we either had, he's no longer Prime Minister of Spain, Zapatero, giving a speech, face mask out, and then as a control condition, we have just a disk on the screen that follows exactly the trajectory of the hand movement. That's one factor. And the second factor was the synchrony between video and speech, either in synchrony or a delay of 1 second. Now, you cannot really isolate the brain network for beat gestures by simply comparing beats versus disks. So although movement is sort of matched, this is of course a much richer visual stimulus than this, and if you just look at the main effect, well, you get broad, very extended activations in visual cortex for beats relative to disks. Cannot really make much sense of this. But with the interaction, you can get much more, how can I say, purer result, or you can better isolate what we're interested in here, because the visual, the stimulus-specific effects are basically subtracted out on either side of the combination, and we're really looking at how the effect of synchrony is more pronounced for beats relative to discs. And then we get much more sensible and cognitively interesting activations, for instance, in the inferior frontal gyrus and the posterior temporal. But this is very much work in progress. Okay, I think that's about it. There's just one slide on stimulus repetition. Don't have too much of them. That's basically the point here. So thank you very much, and these are my collaborators on this kind of research.
So please, if you have questions for Henning.
Can you synchronize the speech to the gesture? What was it synchronized to? What was your... So the last one, did I mishear?
Well, the synchrony was as it was produced by the speaker versus a visual lead of 1,000 milliseconds.
So you just took a section of synchrony.
We had 20 seconds long videos taken from this longer speech. Those were our videos from the live. And they were presented either as is or with audio-visual synchrony moved.
Did you analyze what the synchrony was to the speech? Where you proceeded to synchronous? What was it? What were they, as they spoke, what was the synchrony? What was the unit?
You mean of the individual words relative to what?
Or the structure or the, I mean,
yeah.
was there any, I'm just intrigued by it's the same question to keep the time.
Yeah. To be honest, I don't know. I will have to ask Martin. Yeah.
It's a bit of a broad question, I guess, because I don't do gesture research. But do you really need to categorise things? Can you code things continuously? This is iconic. This is sort of iconic and a bit big. This is more. Do you see what I mean? So I just wonder about whether you can respect a bit of the complexity by not needing. So I mean, maybe that's.
Yeah.
Maybe that's not what you want to do because of how the questions you want to ask. But I'm just kind of curious about that issue of segmentation and categorization and coding and all that kind of stuff.
Well, most systems that I'm aware of are categorical. I think McNeil in his latest scheme is moving more towards a more dimensional measurement, so where you sort of rate how much iconicity is there in this gesture. But I think there aren't many systems that actually use that for research purposes.
Any more questions? Okay, thank you then.